Hi, my name is Melchis Rosario, and I will be going over the neurological side effects of childhood sexual abuse. So, for this presentation, I will be using the acronym CSA to represent childhood sexual abuse. The definition of childhood sexual abuse is perceived or unwanted sexual acts between a child and a perpetrator. So, 33% of women and 16% of men report later in life a history of CSA. That means that approximately 50% of the population is affected by this. And this number could be a lot worse because a lot of people are ashamed to admit that something might be going on with them. So, most likely the numbers are a lot higher. And obviously, they can increase and decrease depending on where you are. So, CSA affects the brain composition and it affects it negatively as well as the as neuroplasticity in the brain. And neuroplasticity is how the brain changes and adapts to different circumstances over time or due to situations. CSA also affects can cause cognitive impairment, which is a broad term for mental disability. And I do have instructions or I do state what type of participants were used for the research that I will be presenting, because not everyone had the exact same CSA experience. And because there are so many different ways that CSA affects the brain, I will only be going over the main lobes that it really affects and the way that it harms it. So for the frontal lobe is where higher executive functions occur. This includes emotional regulation, planning, reasoning, and problem solving. So for the frontal lobe, most of the research was done with people who acquired PTSD from the experience. So not just any CSA victims, but CSA victims with PTSD. So they noticed that they tend to have less blood flow in the frontal lobe. So that means that their day-to-day decision making abilities are affected, as well as their complex decision making abilities. They have a harder time weighing alternatives, interpreting emotional meanings, and they have a really hard time being able to minimize or get rid of fears. For the temporal lobe is in charge of auditory and visual processing, as well as memory. So for the temporal lobe, I thought we had some good news when I was reading the research because it shows that it has more blood flow in that area in CSA victims. But if you think about it, the temporal lobe is in charge of auditory and visual processing, which means that their hearing and their visual is heightened because their bodies are just more tense and just more alert. So they're just always more aware of the surroundings. So this makes them more sensitive to emotions. They tend to have more anxiety and just more phobias in general. For the occipital lobe, this was the one part where we could actually see in an MRI scan the exact difference. And not just blood flow related, but just actual visual difference between CSA victims and non-CSA victims. And this was specifically for girls under the age of 12. They noticed that they had less gray matter in the occipital lobe. So they noticed that they had 18.1% less gray matter in the left visual cortex, which receives the right visuals, and they had 12.6 less gray matter in the right visual cortex, which receives information from the left eye. So here are some of the symptoms CSA victims may have, so behavioral wise, they may have dysfunctional relationships, hostility, they're more prone to substance abuse, sexual dysfunctions, and eating disorders. They're more likely to have insomnia, memory loss, that's where the cognitive impairment comes in, as well as PTSD. Um, Emotionally, they may be more hypervigilant, they may have more fear. And it's interesting to see how you can see how it's interesting to see how more blood flow or less blood flow can cause all these changes. Um, uh, Pain, they may have more headaches, chronic back pain, pelvic pain. Conditions, they're more likely to get to have fatigue, stress, fibromyalgia, IBS, irritable bowel disorder. They're more likely to be obese, to have STIs. And then their entire body systems, like the respiratory system or the gastrointestinal system, may be more affected. So for treatments, most of the treatments are therapeutic, but the the main these are the main steps that therapists use. The first one is removing the child from any kind of dangerous situation. The second thing they do is acknowledge to the child that what happened to them, that it did happen. For some reason, that does help. And then you need to address any specific issues that they might have going on right there, right then and there. Um, Also, destigmatization is a big issue because they may feel like what happened was just happened to them and it's because you're bad or because they deserved it or because they maybe were looking for it or something. So being in therapy groups is actually very helpful for victims of CSA, as well as increasing self-esteem. So some of the things that you can do is, talk about the topic, bring awareness to it. That way, if something does happen to a kid, they are less likely to be quiet about it. The next thing you need to do is believe the victim. If a child comes up to you and says something, you need to believe them. You need to not blame the victim. A lot of times, especially young girls, get blamed and get told that it's because they were being provocative. Another thing that I found interesting was that it says to not make promises that you cannot keep. Do not promise the child that you'll never see the perpetrator again or that they will be locked away forever. Because if the child does end up seeing the perpetrator or does not end up going to trial, then they may lose their trust in you. Also, do not interrogate the child. This should be done by a therapist who will not harm the child further. And then anything that you hear should be immediately reported to the police. Oftentimes, CSA victims, the damage is done by family members, so it may be hard for you to call the police on your spouse, on your brother, your mom, your dad, but it needs to be done. And then these are my sources.